experiment and learn. Now, many organizations are quite siloed and not so good at collaboration, but everyone tells us to use these tools correctly. You must be able to collaborate across an organization because it's horizontal work that needs to be done, not vertical work, if you're really going to use these tools to change your enterprise.
What are some of the biggest mistakes you see organizations and leaders making as they try to bring these tools into their organizations?
One of the biggest mistakes, and they're not making it quite as much, is many leaders first thought of this AI as a technology, and it was about how do we get this technology to work. They now understand it's really about people and cultural transformation. So they are moving towards thinking about what's the experience of our employee or our employees using these technologies. And the experiences vary, as we just talked about. And they need to be bridgers. So as one of the leaders described to us, he needs to be a bridger to close the gap between those people who are more excited and those people who are quite terrified. Because what you really want people to be is maybe curious, but cautious.
Linda Hill is a professor of business administration at the Harvard Business School. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise.
Thank you for having me.
We've got more coverage of AI and its impact on the economy. Sign up for our daily newsletter at marketplace.org/subscribe. In Washington, I'm Kimberly Adams with the Marketplace Morning Report. From APM, American Public Media.
Amelia Island celebrates Amelia Island Dining Month, featuring flavors and chef-driven menus to savor all September long, with accommodations to suit any style, from beachfront resorts to charming B&Bs. Info at ameliaisland.com/dining month. Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com. The North Florida TPO is committed to shaping our transportation future. We're focused on planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, connected community. Learn more at northfloridatpo.com.
This is WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville. Up next, national and local news from NPR and the WJCT News team.
An ICE death in St. Augustine reignites local protests over federal immigration enforcement. Good morning and welcome to the Friday edition of First Coast Connect. I'm Ann Schindler, and on today's Week in Review, we'll also be discussing why a local school board candidate is being criticized for using AI, again, in his campaign ads, and what it means after a U.S. Court of Appeals has, again, shot down the state's Stop Woke law. Finally, we're also going to discuss the record-setting pace of state executions, including 2 on the same day, and what it means for local foodies now that the Culinary Institute is coming to town. Later in the program, art inspired by climate change and great literature. Join the conversation. Reach us on air at 904-549-2937 or go to firstcoastconnect.org to find all the ways to connect with us. Stick around. We'll be back right after the news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Libby Casey. President Trump says the new Air Force One will be temporarily taken out of commission after security concerns were raised about its defense systems. That reporting has become a news story in its own right. NPR's Danielle Kurtzleben reports.
Trump told reporters yesterday that the plane, which his White House received from Qatar, is going to be getting upgrades.
It has a lot of capability, but as I understand it, in about a month or so, they're going to send it to have it be maxed out. So they're going to be sending it, and they'll have it be maxed out. It'll take about a month.
Experts have told NPR that the newer jet probably lacks some defensive capabilities other Air Force One planes have, like missile detection, because of how quickly it was retrofitted. The administration has subpoenaed multiple New York Times journalists over their reporting that the Secret Service urged Trump to take an older Air Force One home from a recent trip to Turkey. Danielle Kurtzleben, NPR News.
Russia and Ukraine continue to exchange fire. The latest Russian airstrikes left at least 3 people dead in Ukraine as Kyiv launched another wave of drones on the Russian capital. NPR's Charles Maines is in Moscow.
According to Moscow authorities, city air defenses intercepted some 400 Ukrainian drones on approach to the capital. Moscow Regional Governor Andrei Vorobyov said several of the intercepted drones set fire to civilian infrastructure, injuring 2 people, but provided few other details. Yet images circulating on social media suggested an oil refinery was among objects damaged. In recent months, Ukraine has repeatedly targeted Russian energy infrastructure with long-range drone and missile strikes, causing fuel shortages and gas rationing across the country. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has vowed to continue attacks in a bid to force the Kremlin to negotiate an end to the war, now in its 5th year. Charles Maines, NPR News, Moscow.
A new immigration rule may make it harder for international students to finish their studies in the U.S. Historically, international students could remain in the States as long as they were making progress in their academic program. But starting in mid-September, they will have up to 4 years to finish or apply for a formal extension and pay a fee. NPR's Alyssa Nadworny reports.
The Department of Homeland Security says the change will strengthen national security through regular vetting and cut down on what it calls, quote, forever students. Universities worry this could impact programs like PhDs, which often take far longer than 4 years. There's also new restrictions on switching programs and changing majors. One of the selling points in the U.S. system is you come to college to explore, to find yourself. You can double major, you can switch majors. That's what makes it so attractive and unique. Critics of the new policy say this is an example of how the goals of immigration are butting up against the goals of American higher ed. Alyssa Nadworny, NPR News.
Americans are now paying an average of $4 a gallon for regular gasoline, according to AAA. This is NPR News.
Good morning. You're listening to WJCT News 89.9 in Jacksonville. I'm Stephen Ponson. It is 9:04. The Jacksonville metro area unemployment rate rose slightly in June, but area businesses reported a net gain in jobs for the first time this year. The unemployment rate for Baker, Clay, Duval, Nassau, and St. Johns counties rose to 4.8% last month from 4.7% in May, according to the latest numbers from the Florida Department of Commerce. Rising unemployment in June is a normal seasonal trend as high school and college graduates enter the workforce and look for jobs, that according to news partners at the Jacksonville Daily Record. Despite the rising unemployment rate, non-farm businesses in the Jacksonville area reported an increase of 2,600 jobs from June last year to June this year. It's the first time this year that there's been a net gain in jobs after 5 straight months of job losses. Residents in St. Johns County are invited to share their opinions in a survey available now through the public library system. The county says the feedback will be used to help shape the system's services and programs. The survey is open to all county residents who use the public library system and asks questions related to community needs, awareness of services, perceived barriers to use, and priorities for future offerings. A physical copy of the survey is available upon request at any public library location. To access the online community survey, visit sjcpls.org. The survey is open until September 15th. Storms are possible along the I-95 corridor this afternoon here in Northeast Florida. Temperatures expected to reach the low to mid-90s today.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include the George Lucas Educational Foundation, creator of Edutopia. For 35 years, sharing what works in schools today and working to inspire new ways to learn tomorrow. More at edutopia.org.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health and North Florida TPO.
Welcome to First Coast Connect this Monday morning. I'm Ann Schindler. Today, a former Republican state senator says the November property tax amendment is biased, misleading, and unconstitutional, and he's suing to stop it. We sit down with policy expert Jeff Brandis. Later in the program, a UNF poll offers an early look at possible outcomes in the governor's race and growing opposition to data centers. Also, a restaurant synonymous with Jacksonville partners with the city at a new downtown riverfront location. But first, he calls it the blast radius nobody is talking about, a gutting of local government power if a property tax cut moves forward. Here to discuss it, we're joined by Jeff Brandes, president of the Florida Policy Project, a nonpartisan think tank. Before founding the group, he served for 12 years as a Republican lawmaker in the Florida legislature. Jeff Brandes, thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
So the economic impacts of this ballot initiative are enormous for local governments, nearly $12 billion estimated in terms of that impact and lost revenue. But you've said everyone is talking about property taxes. Almost nobody is talking about power. Explain to us why you think the political impacts of this are so significant.
Well, sure. The governor has admitted that he is likely going to bankrupt some small cities and counties across the state of Florida. This is why he needed the trust fund in order to backfill with what he called budget dust out of the state coffers, these cities and counties. Well, the cities and counties they're going to have to come to Tallahassee and ask for that money. And this means that ultimately they don't control their own budgets. They have to rely on Tallahassee to fund their police and firefighters and core services. And if that's the case, then why do we need them to be the mayor if they've got to go to the governor or to the legislature in order to get their budgets fulfilled? And so ultimately, this is a question of power. Could the legislature say no? Could the legislature define what their tax rates must be in order to qualify? I think these are all really interesting and open questions that need to be answered that, frankly, the governor and the legislature have so far punted on.
So Amendment 3, I think it's important for our listeners to explain a little bit about what it does, because we're talking right away about power impacts, budget dust that could be greatly impacting the budgets of smaller counties. Explain to us, if you can, just briefly, how is this going to impact perhaps counties that are more dependent on residential, homesteaded, or just generally residential property taxes, rural counties, more than it might some larger cities and counties?
Sure. So the governor loves to talk about Florida as a whole, but Florida is 67 different counties and 411 different cities, all with different levels of participation and of homestead, and also different home values. The average home values are $500,000, $600,000, $700,000. Others are more modest. They're in that $250,000 to $300,000 kind of range. And some have, relatively low participation in homesteaded properties, in the kind of 30s, 40%, where others are well into the 50 or 60% homesteaded, like Volusia or Sumter County. And so you have a huge range of impacts that, frankly, were not modeled before this amendment was put on the ballot. The legislature didn't know what the numbers were. The governor didn't know what the numbers were on a city-by-city or county-by-county basis. In fact, we are just now crowdsourcing this and finding it out today. And so different cities have wildly different reactions to this because, and it's not based on, this is the city that was overspending the most. It frankly is what city is homesteaded the most, and frankly, where are the values the most modest that will get impacted. So my major problem with this entire amendment is nobody's researched it. There was no due diligence done. We don't know the impact to cities and counties. This is a little bit like doing kind of surgery without doing the diagnostics on 411 different cities and 67 different patients. This is the kind of challenge that we run into is we're going to be talking about the impacts of this, but they're so different across the entire universe of communities.
We've talked a little bit on this program about this property tax amendment proposal before. And, in terms of the economic impact, the fact that this wasn't given a thorough analysis before it was approved by the legislature. And in fact, that the governor had been talking about this for about a year and a half before he introduced his proposal to the legislature just about 48 hours before they had to start debating its merits at this special session. Do you believe that was a deliberate delay in terms of analyzing it or allowing the state's Office of Economic and Demographic Research to see how these cuts might be impacting local budgets?
I think it was all deliberate. I think it was deliberate that they didn't want the legislature to have the information. They didn't want them to have a city-by-city, county-by-county impact. They tried to push it through as quickly as possible with as little information as possible, because they knew if the legislature was informed, they wouldn't have voted for it and supported it. And that's the challenge, right? But because of they file it on a Friday, he has the budget on his desk. Qualifying still open, so if you voted against it, he was going to not only cut your budgets, potentially threaten you with running somebody against you. But ultimately, this is ultimately not the governor's responsibility. The legislature is in charge of putting these on the ballot. I don't blame the governor. The governor is going to put pressure on the legislature. That's what he does. But I blame the legislature because they committed malpractice. I think your legislative leaders absolutely failed to support their membership. If they had just waited 2 weeks, then we would have been, I think, in a totally different place. But frankly, they voted on something they don't know the impacts of. And frankly, nobody in Florida knows the impacts of, because we're just discovering. And if the provisions in this amendment pieces are found unconstitutional, like the 5-year residency requirement, listen, it's not a $12 billion number anymore. It could easily be a $14 billion number.
Yeah, I want to get into that and, kind of how that number could play out and your lawsuit. But when you say if they just waited 2 weeks, what are you referring to there?
Well, had they waited 2 weeks, they would have been outside the budget window. So the governor would have had to have signed the budget in those 2 weeks. And so the sword hanging above their heads and the fear that, oh my gosh, the governor could cut my budget projects would have been gone. And frankly, qualifying for candidates would have been over. So any of the leverage the governor would have had, frankly, would have gone away in 2 weeks. And they would have had 2 weeks of data from their communities to actually evaluate this. This is, we don't make major decisions in the Constitution in a 48-hour period. The responsibility of the Speaker and the Senate President, and frankly, the next Speaker and the next Senate President, are to slow this process down, to be thoughtful, to be judicious about how they think about these problems, and frankly, to have the data to make informed decisions. Nobody can claim that they had the data to make an informed decision on this, because the data didn't come out for 2 or 3 weeks. In fact, it's still coming out.
Yeah. If you're just joining us, we are talking to the president of the Florida Policy Project and former Republican State Senator Jeff Brandes. He recently filed a bipartisan lawsuit with former Democratic Congressman Al Lawson, challenging the legality and constitutionality of the ballot language of Amendment 3. If you would like to join our conversation or have a comment or question, you can reach us on air at 904-549-2937, or you can email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. So I want to ask you about this lawsuit. You have said that this is the most fundamental change ever proposed to Florida's longstanding property tax system. Obviously, it's going to be a major hit, as we mentioned, if it moves forward, if it's approved by voters in November by 60% or more. But this lawsuit that you have filed with Al Lawson is determined to change the language. You couldn't remove it from the ballot through a lawsuit, but you could affect a change in the way it's titled or the way it's described. So tell us about this lawsuit. First of all, why file it? Why did you want it to be a bipartisan effort with Al Lawson?
Well, I think it speaks to the fact that you have two former elected officials that understand this process pretty well, that understand we've seen constitutional challenges on ballot language before. And frankly, all we're asking the state to do is to follow its own rules, right? So the courts have already ruled on a variety of different constitutional amendments in the past and said you can't use words like save. There was an amendment a few years ago that said we wanted to save the Everglades. Well, the court says, listen, you're not going to lose the Everglades if this amendment doesn't pass, just like you're not going to lose the homestead exemption if this amendment that's on the ballot right now doesn't pass, right? So you can't use leading language. It's kind of like tilting the pinball machine, right? That you can't do that. And so ultimately what we're seeing here is it's a variety of language that the legislature has used in this amendment, and frankly the governor's office has used in this amendment, we think is frankly political kind of partisan, not so partisan language, but it's definitely like leading the witness type of language that frankly we can't do. We want it to be a factual-based amendment. Just tell me what it tell me what it does. Don't tell me that it helps small businesses when it, frankly, I can give you an argument that it hurts small businesses. If communities raise millage, small businesses don't get help. Frankly, it doesn't. That there are a variety of things in this amendment that, frankly, just aren't accurate or untrue, or frankly, where the legislature is clearly violating what we believe is the constitutional precedent that the court has set over generations.
And your lawsuit identifies essentially 6 problems with the ballot amendment. But to your point, what you call advocacy language rather than neutral language is the number one complaint. The fact that you're arguing it lacks neutrality. And you have some examples, which you say are basically talking points, how the language of the amendment says it ensures fairness, it benefits taxpayers, it's protecting small businesses. But I think it's interesting in your lawsuit, you point out the language of prior homestead ballot titles, whereas this one is titled Save Our Homes from Excessive Property Taxes. Prior proposals for homestead-related exemptions or changes to the law were titled things like exemption property tax limit for non-homestead property, ad valorem property taxation assessments, exemptions, limitations, or property tax limitations, property value decline. Very, really kind of boring, actually, titles for things that maybe don't grab voters in quite the same way as save our homes from excessive property taxes.
Right. Well, it shows you what their intent was, right? So was their intent was it to have it rewritten? It's not like the governor's office doesn't have smart attorneys that work there. They've all graduated from law school. They've all passed the bar. They've all read the constitutional opinions. Why did they knowingly choose to put language that, frankly, is advocacy on the ballot? I don't know. That's a governor's question. But clearly they understood that this was going to lead to litigation, and clearly they understood that I actually think there's so many infirmities in this constitutional amendment that, frankly, the court may have to throw it back to the legislature to fix. I don't think you can fix this with the AG, because I think at some juncture you start running into separation of power issues. So I don't know how this plays out. All I know is they did this on purpose.
Explain.
Why did they do it on purpose?
Yeah, I want you to give me some theories there. Why would they craft ballot language that they know is something that could be challenged in court and perhaps overturned?
Well, I think one theory is that the governor actually doesn't want this to pass. I think one theory is that he felt pregnant by having talked about this for the last 18 months on Fox News and every news channel he could talk to for the last 18 months. And frankly, then the legislature, doesn't do anything. He feels like, oh my gosh, I've got to throw something together. Some deputy chief of staff throws a constitutional amendment together, and then they throw it on the ballot, and he comes out and tepidly supports it. And then as soon as the legislature changes a few things, not materially, but kind of pulls out the education piece and strips off the trust fund because they can deal with that at a later date, he decides to abandon the entire amendment, right? So I think, there's not a lot of coincidences in politics. This is predominantly 80% still the governor's amendment, but now he's rejecting it. Why? Right? I think he's realizing that this is chaos for the next governor. This is handing the next governor a massive dumpster fire of issues because the math is all wrong. The math doesn't work. And cities and counties are already making adjustments. They're already talking about moving to non-ad valorem taxation. They're already talking about what fees they're going to implement, what parks are going to close, and how much parking is going to cost in the future to backfill budgets. And they're already looking at small counties going, oh my gosh, is this going to force my small county to merge into another county or small cities to merge into the county? And the counties, frankly, don't want those cities. They don't want the liabilities that go along with them. So I think there is, this was really all, to me, a setup by the governor for 28 or 32, whenever he's going to run next for president of the United States, to be able to come out and say, hey, look, I tried to cut property taxes in Florida, or I did cut property taxes in Florida. But there's no math behind this, and the math only gets worse for cities every single year. Property taxes are, frankly, the base foundation of how we've built Florida, at least the counties and cities, how they fund local government. And when we strip that away, we say, all right, well, what do we fund it on? People say, oh, well, we're just going to cut it, the fraud, waste, and abuse. Okay, great. Even the CFO's office has not come out and found kind of $12 billion recurring that they're going to say of how they can save without cutting core services. So I think, frankly, part of me believes that, frankly, the governor just doesn't want this to pass, that he did it for show. but it's kind of like rolling a live grenade into your Constitution. It's a very dangerous game that's going to have massive complications if down the road if this were to pass.
I want to take a call from John in Riverside. Good morning, John. Go ahead.
Good morning. I wanted to say that this is the type of major change in a state that a governor should make when he's coming into office. If he's got a vision for how Florida can be financed without the property tax, he should have done it when he first came, and he could administer the change and handle the problems. I think your speaker just, pretty much made my point that he's leaving huge problems for the next governor. As far as fraud, waste, and abuse, they've had control of the government in Florida for decades now. If there's any fraud, waste, and abuse, it's theirs. And lastly, when they take control from the local governments to the state house, we wind up with cities that may want to have something like a gay crosswalk, but because the people in the Panhandle don't want that sort of thing in the Panhandle, can't have it anywhere in this state. It's fine if the Panhandle doesn't want certain things, but Fort Lauderdale ought to be able to have what it wants too.
John, thank you. Jeff Brandes, I know that you have said something along those lines. The governor doesn't have to eat his own cookie, I think is how you put it.
Cooking, his own cooking, yeah.
His own cooking, okay.
Yeah, right.
So you're saying that if he wanted something like this to pass, he should be there to administer it and kind of face the consequences, as John was saying, as opposed to leaving it. Yeah.
Right, he gets to walk away. I mean, this thing gets, if it goes on the ballot in November, it doesn't really get implemented until January, and then it's up to the next governor, whoever that is, to have to manage the fallout. To have to manage countless counties coming to them saying we need money for X, or cities coming to them and saying we can no longer fund our budgets. And frankly, if the math is wrong, then it's a lot worse for the next governor. And I think the math is wrong.
So I want to talk to a little bit more about the contents of this lawsuit, because you really break down, aside from just the language, some of the claims that it makes in terms of promises that it will benefit Florida taxpayers. That's something that you look at in terms of, that's a very broad statement. There are a lot of taxpayers in Florida. And in fact, this could ultimately be what you call more of a tax shift than a tax cut.
Correct. Listen, a ballot summer isn't supposed to persuade voters. It's supposed to inform voters. And the Supreme Court has repeatedly said that the ballot language must be clear and accurate, not misleading. And what the legislature has put on the ballot and the governor's office has put on the ballot is, we would argue, misleading and doesn't actually inform voters. Think about, just the statement of it protects small businesses. Well, nothing really in this amendment specifically speaks to small businesses other than lowering for all property owners, the commercial property owners, the annual rate cap or lowering it from 10% rise to a 5% rise. But it doesn't say that their millage could go up, which it easily could. It couldn't say that they could face non-ad valorem taxes, which they easily could. In fact, there's a variety of scenarios here that play out for both homeowners and for small businesses, where after this amendment passes, their taxes go up. Even long-term homesteaded property owners who would vote for this, if a county or city shifts to non-ad valorem, which they're perfectly able to do, now all of a sudden they could potentially pay more in tax. So they could pay a $500 fire fee or a $700 police fee on top of their ad valorem. And so none of that is discussed within the ballot language. But we frankly think that should be discussed. It's like a disclaimer that should be added to these things, because they're kind of telling you all the great stuff. They're not going to tell you that the side effects of this are going to last a lot more than 4 hours. They can last generations.
In a couple of minutes, we're going to be talking about a new poll that was released by the University of North Florida's Public Opinion Research Lab that came out this morning. One of the things that they asked respondents about was this question. And they found that if they just asked people, do you support this? 61%, which is a slim margin, but enough to pass because the threshold is 60% of voters, said that they would, support this, that they would vote for it. When given information about the budget impacts, specifically the almost $12 billion municipal budget shortfall that it is estimated to generate over the next couple of years, that support dropped to 45%, which obviously is less than half, but also notably less than the 60% required to pass. So, I guess that speaks to the importance of ballot language. How optimistic are you of this lawsuit having some degree of success? I think that you filed it in Leon County. That has sometimes been a friendlier county for challenges to this governor and his administration, but very often at the next level, the appellate level, wherever it moves on appeal, is perhaps a little friendlier to the governor. And ultimately, I'm curious what your thoughts are about your success through that process.
Well, I think we'll be very successful through that process. Listen, I mean, unless the court is going to start violating decades of precedent, then we think we're on pretty good footing to challenge this amendment. There has been a variety of cases that have come out of this court and up to the Supreme Court over the last few years, specifically on ballot language, where it specifically says you can't use persuasive language. I mean, it's hard to argue that the language that they are using isn't persuasive, or that it's even accurate, because I would argue that most of it's not even accurate. And frankly, what your poll shows is that the more you people understand about this amendment, the less they like it. Why? Because they feel like they're being sold a bill of goods, right? They're saying that their taxes are going to go down. But for some, that could go up. Well, that isn't disclosed in here. What isn't disclosed is renters get nothing out of this. I mean, 1/3 of Floridians rent. There is no benefit for them. In fact, for them, it's all cost, no benefit. Because if they raise sales tax or they raise non-ad valorem, they're going to pay that through higher rents. So I think ultimately, this is one of those areas where I don't know who's advocating on the pro side. Who's going to come out and put $10, $20, $30 million on the support side for this amendment out there? I know who's putting out the money against it. The large landowners, your big box retailers, your apartment complexes, all the people who are going to be faced with higher tax bills across the state of Florida and higher millage rates or whatever, are looking to kind of fight one battle versus fight 1,000 small battles.
We've got a call from Daryl in St. Augustine. Good morning, Daryl. Go ahead.
Hey, good morning, Ann, and thank you. It's a great show and a great guest. Yes, I agree with your guest that this is just a propaganda ploy by DeSantis for his next campaign. I was completely against this amendment when it came out because it, like the rest of the stuff, is taking power away from the local government. And I'm, absolutely against the state having more power over the locals. However, my position has changed a little bit, primarily because this seems to be pushing the taxes to the rich and giving a break to the less successful or the middle class. And so, as it stands right now, fine, give the people with a house under $250,000 a break, and the people with the $2 million house increase their taxes, increase their property taxes. That's kind of where I am. So explain to me why I'm wrong.
All right.
This amendment doesn't do that. It doesn't do that. It doesn't raise taxes on $2 million homes. In fact, it proposes a long-term plan to eliminate all taxes on $1 million homes and shift that to small businesses and renters. That's what it does. There's one of the provisions of this constitutional amendment is that the legislature come up with a schedule, not implement it, but come up with a schedule to eliminate all property taxes in Florida, or at least all homesteaded property taxes in Florida. That's required by that. But even if they don't do that, once it reaches the $250,000 level, it just begins to adjust for inflation. So after a decade, it's $350, then it's another 20 years, it's $450. And it goes up every year. So, but nothing in here kind of shifts the burden to $2 million plus properties.
I mean, specifically to that question, your lawsuit mentions that the idea of expanding this to include, or the fact that it does include non-homesteaded properties in terms of businesses, you point out that this could be impacting not just homesteaded properties, obviously, but a second home that Bill Gates owns or a data center, that those would be included in the universe of people who will benefit.
Of capped. Correct. Well, because they get capped, right? Their prices, their rates can't go up more than 10% a year today. This drops it down from 10% to 5%. So their rates couldn't go up more than 5%. But if a community needs money and they need to go to get millage, they can raise their millage. And who does that millage hit? Well, it hits the commercial properties, it hits the renters, and it hits the non-homesteaded properties, as well as it hitting the homesteaded properties as well. So, well, there's an exemption. Once they start raising millage, you know, the math is still the math there of how that millage gets played out. So it's just, again, the downstream consequences, the second order effects that nobody's really talked about.
We've got a call from Peter on the south side. Good morning, Peter. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. The fundamental question, I think, here is a failure of the legislature to act. It's not unusual to expect the average voter to vote for their pocketbook and to expect them to think that their taxes pay for police, fire, and garbage, and, who cares about the rest? So I think there's a fundamental democratic problem here. I'm sorry to put it so.
I don't disagree with you. Honestly, I don't disagree with you. Look, the legislature had an opportunity to put something together. They chose not to. The governor's office had, but I think ultimately they waited on the governor's office. He was the one leading on this. He was the one to go out in front of this. The legislature gave the governor $1 million last year to study it. They said, listen, let's spend a year looking at it, and you can design the study, Governor. We can do it ourselves. They admitted that, but they said, we'll give you $1 million. You can design any study you want that looks at property taxes. And he vetoed it. He said, we don't need to know it. We don't need to study it. We know it needs to be done. And then what he did was not exactly what he said needed to be done, because what he said needed to be done was to get rid of all homesteaded property taxes. That was what he talked about for a full year and what he said it needed to be done. And then he comes out with this plan that doesn't do that. So, and frankly, comes out with a plan that isn't studied, that we're just now getting the information on. We just got 2 weeks ago the information on the counties. Just this week, we're getting the information on the cities. So we've just had the city information for less than 6 or 7 days. So what we find is, yes, the legislature could do it. But frankly, the right organization I think that needs to do this is like the Taxing and Budget Commission, which comes out next year, which I think that the next governor will likely punt this to if it doesn't pass. What needs to happen is that you need a thoughtful, organized way to think about this, with that bringing in economists, thinking about downstream effects. I'm somebody who totally 100% supports cutting taxes, but you've got to be thoughtful about how you do it and understand the impacts of what you do. The legislature kind of threw caution to the wind here and said we're gonna put this on the ballot without understanding how this impacts the cities, counties, government downstream. Doesn't understand how it's going to backfill local governments. Has not created a trust fund. Doesn't understand what taxes it's going to raise to fund that trust fund, because it doesn't have the budget to put billions of dollars towards cities and counties next year.
Just briefly, I want to touch on the concerns about the unconstitutionality in terms of equal protection under the law. That's something that you raise in this lawsuit, because this homestead exemption would require people who don't currently homestead to have a 5-year residency in Florida before they could avail themselves of this. And you believe that that's something that could result in a legal challenge and ultimately possibly open this and the state to an entire whole new cohort of people eligible for this property tax cut.
Absolutely. So let's just take Jacksonville, for example, right? You have a huge military population in Jacksonville, at Jackson AS. And so if Jacksonville Naval Air Station, let's just say you're a young ensign coming down there as your first duty station, and you're here working at Jackson AS, you're telling me you want to buy a house. You're telling me that you don't get the same benefit that somebody who just moved here in 2026 got, because they moved here in 2026. You've got to wait 5 years to receive that benefit if you move here in 2027. Or a 30-year retired veteran wants to move to Florida. You're going to tell me that he's got to wait 5 years in order to get that benefit that somebody who was just happened to be moved here in 2026 gets? No, the court doesn't allow this. The U.S. Constitution doesn't allow you to create second-class citizens. The 14th Amendment has an equal protection clause. It has a right to travel. This has really largely been settled as case law. And so it's likely that that provision is unconstitutional. Now, if that provision is unconstitutional, then all the numbers that we're talking about are wrong, because all the numbers assume today that basically all your new residents for the first 5 years will not get this benefit. But if it's wrong, now, and day one, they get the homestead benefit, and they can get this benefit within the first year of living here, your numbers are all wrong, and your impacts to your cities and counties are all wrong, and they're much greater, or potentially much greater, than what's being currently kind of told to them today.
Well, it's an issue that we will continue to follow, and we certainly appreciate you joining us today. Jeff Brandes, he is the founder and president of the Florida Policy Project and former Republican state senator here in Florida. Jeff Brandes, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Great to be with you.
Up next, from data centers to the reflecting pool, we hear from voters in a new University of North Florida poll. Welcome back. A new poll takes the pulse of voters ahead of the midterm elections, including their views on President Trump, as well as their biggest affordability concerns. Here to tell us about it, we are joined by Sean Frieder. He's assistant professor of political science at the University of North Florida and director of the school's Public Opinion Research Lab. Dr. Frieder, thanks for being here.
Always great to be here.
So to quickly highlight some of the things that are covered in the poll, you talk about the governor's race, you talk about the Senate race. We're going to get into that a little bit more specifically. You do talk about the property tax issue, which we were just discussing with Jeff Brandes. And there was a funny headline this morning that published by our colleague A.G. Gankarski in Florida Politics. He wrote, Amendment 3 can pass, but only if voters never learn what it does, new UNF poll finds. And that is kind of what you found. Tell us about that.
That's essentially correct. If you just give people kind of a neutral or standard ballot language that it's there to protect core services, but you don't talk about the budget impact, you're looking at probably about 61% right now, and that's going to squeak it right over the line of that 60% threshold. If you tell people what the budget impact is, it's a pretty significant change. It goes down to about 45% support. So, that's not even close to the 60% threshold, doesn't even hit majority. So I think the language that's going to be on the ballot is really a big part of the game. Even outside of the language, even regardless of what happens with the lawsuit, the very fact this is a lawsuit and that this is being covered and we're talking about those numbers, that's other ways for people to find out about the budget impact. So I think this somewhat spells trouble for those wanting it to pass.
You are telling them when you talk about the impacts, this estimate that's come from the state itself. It's not numbers that you're making up, this potential
Correct.
impact. Do you think that the number of people who say that they will not support it or the decline that's shown is even accurate? I'm curious if some people are perhaps reluctant to reverse themselves, even if they're given that additional information, just sort of a cognitive dissonance thing.
Yeah, that's something when you do, you ask about something and then you slightly change the language, ask again. I mean, ideally what you do in this case is run a split sample. You'd have half people who have never seen that language at all, half that see the other language. For a variety of reasons, we can't do it that way in this survey, but you do worry that people maybe have a little bit of remorse of, well, I'll stick to what I said before. So I think if anything, the numbers have a downside. This could be even worse for the amendment if you were to ask the language just first without that initial question.
So governor's race was one thing that you honed in on. Byron Donalds, who is President Trump's anointed, gubernatorial candidate, has a 5-point lead. And you looked at head-to-heads in the November race as well, where he would presumably be facing Democrat David Jolly. So a significant advantage. A 5-point lead is outside the margin of error, right? I mean, that is a real advantage.
Just outside the margin of error. We think at this point in the campaign, Donalds has the advantage. But again, I see a lot of upside there for the Jolly campaign. We talked to an unusually high number of Republicans in this. So, weighting does a little bit of the work for us in this and bringing the numbers back to what we think the actual sample will look like.
Talk about weighting. Like, what is that?
So when we...
And that's WEIGHT, not WAIT.
Correct.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. So, increasingly, as response rates goes down for polls, you try and get as much of a random sample as you can, but you're still going to get somewhat of an off sample. You got the kind of people who are going to pick up phones and talk to you. We mix in order to try and compensate for that, some texting, some online polling, but we're using the voter file. It's based off of a probability sample, so we're randomly talking to voters who might appear. We're talking to those who say that they're likely or definitely will vote in the upcoming election, but that still sometimes means, usually what you worry about is not enough Republicans talking to you. This has been a problem in the past decade, Republican non-response bias. This time we actually got a little bit more than we expected. So we had somewhat of an unusually high sample, about a 20-point gap in turnout in favor of Republicans. We don't think that that's what the November election is eventually going to look like. So weights help us correct for that by taking that down and making it look more like recent elections, previous elections, where we have a baseline of what we really think those numbers will look like.
Do you talk about those numbers when you're releasing the poll in terms of a gap in likely turnout?
We do. That's in our methodology section. Less looked at by folks.
I didn't get that deep. I'm sorry. Since 5 this morning. So Angie Nixon, Ashley Moody, Alexander Vindman. This is the race for U.S. Senator in Florida. Ashley Moody obviously is the incumbent. She has a strong response. 50% say, 50% support in this poll. But when she's up against these Democrats, it is 50 to 42 in the case of Angie Nixon, or 50 to 40 in the case of Alexander Vindman. That's a sizable difference, but I think in your analysis, you think it's maybe closer than some might expect.
I mean, these numbers are already trending in the direction Democrats would want to see. And this is already a midterm election, too. Midterm elections are notoriously difficult for the party that's recently captured the White House. So in 2022, it was the Democrats' time to face more difficulty, although the timing of the passage of the decision on abortion somewhat helped Democrats remain buoyant in that election. Looking at, we also ran numbers on Trump, even in Florida, where he clearly won the election very easily back in 2024. His numbers are now a bit underwater. He had -3 favorability in our polling. So the fact that, sort of the headwinds are moving in the direction of Democrats, that signals to us that, especially seeing as we're talking to maybe an unusually high number of Republicans in this particular sample, I think the upside is there for the Democratic candidates. I think that the Jolly campaign is more in what we call stabbing distance for something being a real competition in November. I think that the Democratic candidates are going to have to work a little bit more when fighting Moody, especially seeing as there might be a little bit more sour grapes amongst Democrats. Nixon and Vindman have very different philosophies in terms of how they're approaching running for the race, what their ideological policy positions might be. So this is also the case for Republicans. There's still a Republican primary and a Democratic primary to be had. So what the numbers look like once that dust settles and once people have decided, am I going to, if I voted for the also ran candidate, am I then going to vote for the person that actually won? An October poll, which we'll be running, will be the place to look for that.
One other topic that you dug into that I thought was interesting was the reflecting pool. That's something that's been in the news lately. How do you decide when you're going to include a topic like that that's in the headlines in your poll? Because, and I want you to give us a little context for that, because I wonder if people who are answering that poll don't hear that with a little sense of bias in even the question itself. The idea that, do you support the president's view or his stated explanation or not? It does seem to have almost like an inherent little bit of assumption about the falsity of his analysis. Maybe I'm overreading it.
So we try and ask when we worry about leading with the poll question. The way that we ask the question is we offer a couple different explanations. We offer what the president has offered. It says his explanation for the algae appearing in the reflecting pool. We offer what the opposition has had as explanation. So I think that offering both sides of that is about as neutral as we can get in the poll in order to set up the proper context that's needed for them to respond. When we ask about it, we find that the vandalism story generally is not accepted to the extent that President Trump, I'm sure, would like. That's true even amongst the Republicans in our sample. Less than a majority said that they thought that the answer for why the reflecting pool had happened that way was vandalism rather than maybe just a poorly handled renovation or maybe just natural scientific processes.
Yeah. Does that indicate anything to you larger than that question, or is that just about that specific headline?
I mean, to get to your other question from before, we ask questions every once in a while if we think it's something the media has covered a lot, and I haven't seen a lot of polling on in Florida or nationwide, and this was one of those questions. It's received a lot of attention. If we're to draw outside of which this is sort of an interesting question on something that's been covered a lot by the media, I would say, how much does Trump have rhetorical coverage, within his own base? And if he's struggling to even get a majority of his base to accept what he's saying on an issue that's pretty important, at least to him, that might spell trouble for him.
Gotcha. And so you also looked at approval ratings for the president and his vice president, as well as our governor, Ron DeSantis, and Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, former senator from Florida. And you basically found that of those four men, that President Trump's approval ratings were the lowest. Tell us a little bit about how that broke down, what you saw happening in terms of J.D. Vance's approval ratings relative to Rubio's and DeSantis's.
Yeah, we find Trump and Vance, let's say negative in a minor sense, -3 for Trump, very similar for Vance, maybe a little bit less negative. I would put it as the farther you get away from Trump, the more that your numbers look a bit better. Rubio, again, is within the White House, but when you think about Trump, you think about the campaign slogans, Trump Vance. They're very well connected, president and vice president. Rubio's a lot less likely for the average voter to be top of mind, and his numbers look much better, more similar to DeSantis, who's again removed from Trump. So again, I think this spells possible going forward in the presidential race in 2028, difficulties for Vance. I think it provides potential opportunities for Rubio and DeSantis. But again, every time we speculate about something that's going to happen over 2 years from now, reality gets in our way 2 or 3 or 20 or 40 times between then and now. So hard to say, but it suggests that Vance might not be automatically coronated as the new frontrunner in 2028 just because he's proximate to Trump.
In terms of the president, you looked more than just at approval ratings, specifically at his demeanor, and asked people about his speech and his personality. Tell us what those results were and kind of why you wanted to get into that area.
So in addition to just trying to get general feelings about him, we want to understand, what dimensions come to mind when people are thinking. We didn't have the space on the poll to ask about all dimensions. We would like to have asked about economic feelings, his handling of immigration, which are also common dimensions that we break out. We broke out 2 dimensions, foreign policy and rhetoric, demeanor, personality. Foreign policy does a little bit worse than his favorability numbers do. Rhetoric does significantly worse than his favorability numbers. So, one way to read this is that what's keeping him a little bit more afloat, I would say, that's likely immigration. That's not something we ask about in our poll, but if you look at any number of dozens of polls over the last couple of years, his numbers are still underwater with Americans nationally on immigration, but that's where he does the best. And I think that that's keeping him somewhat more afloat. The economy, maybe people are a little bit more forgiving there. We don't ask about that as well. But foreign policy, people are not liking what they're seeing as much, and particularly on rhetoric. But, we've been saying this about Trump for a decade. His rhetoric kind of falls behind his numbers on other policy issues. It doesn't seem to be something that's hurt him, and I would say it doesn't really continue to hurt him that much. His base is kind of willing to accept whatever comes of his rhetoric in order to get what they like in terms of policy.
Well, it's a great poll. We love having you on. Sean Frieder from University of North Florida. Appreciate it.
Always. Thank you.
All right. Up next, a beloved local chain is setting up shop in downtown. We sit down with the owner of European Street Cafe to hear about his plans.
Terrell Hogan Law.
I'm Wayne Hogan. At 60 miles an hour, 18-wheelers can take the length of a football field to stop, and the law requires them to stay 300 feet apart.
More at TerrellHoganLaw.com. Jack's Chamber, with 3,000 members in Northeast Florida, is dedicated to driving economic growth and ensuring everyone has the opportunity to succeed. Membership offers business leaders opportunities to connect with each other and with the community. More at jackschamber.com.
Harriet Clark was 11 months old when her mother was a getaway driver in the infamous 1981 robbery of a Brinks truck. The robbers were members of radical offshoots of the Weather Underground and the Black Panthers. For the next 37 years, Harriet spent Saturdays visiting her mother in prison. Her new novel is based on that. She's on the next Fresh Air. Join us.
Today at noon on WJCT News 89.9.
You know those best if used by or consumed by labels on food?
Well,
something like 20% of all food waste is attributed to confusion over date labels.
California recently banned most food expiration labeling. It's a huge change, and one that forces the question of who decides the dates, how they choose, and whether they're needed at all. That's on the next On Point.
Today at 11, here on WJCT News 89.9.
How many people does it take to build an effective protest or even revolution? The startling answer, research shows, is only 4% of the population. But being a dissident is about more than showing up. We hear the advice gleaned from more than 100 of them worldwide next time on 1A.
Today, starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
Welcome back. Well, we're going to start talking a little bit about European history and future. Following news of its expansion into downtown, European Street Cafe is the newest name that is going to be in the center of downtown serving food. We're joined now by the owner of European Street Cafe, Andy Zarka. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And congratulations.
Thanks so much.
So this is now your fourth location.
Yes.
Yes. It is going to be at the Riverfront Plaza, former Landing. And you've been around long enough in this city, going on 5 decades of various locations and identity. And I'm curious how, like, have you ever envisioned yourself as part of that downtown location? Certainly the Landing was iconic for all of us for many, many years as a destination. And now having your restaurant as the centerpiece, it must be kind of, I'm curious how you're taking it.
Well, all right. So not the centerpiece. We're just one of the many pieces that is going to revitalize that area and, make it as special as it should be. I grew up going to the Landing. I was one of the people that was really upset when we tore it down without a plan to do something new. So the fact that I get to, bring our restaurant and be a part of this next chapter means the world to me. So many days spent down there on the river, eating, drinking, hanging out with family and friends, and to be able to bring that back means a lot.
Yeah. So you say not the centerpiece, but certainly in this park, you are going to be the real focal point. I mean, there's eventually going to be another restaurant, but you're going to be the first. You're going to be occupying this space alongside park for kids, this elaborate walkway on the riverfront, and it is, a beautiful parcel. So how does it work, this relationship with the city? How did you end up, winning this request for proposals to become chosen to be the vendor at that site?
Well, when the RFP came out, I was actually a little bit late to the game and only had a couple days. I had been waiting for it to come out, and I missed it. But so we had a couple days, but with my marketing team, we put together all the documents, and we made a compelling enough argument that that we were the right people to be there. That our longstanding restaurants here in town, being kind of a part of the fabric of dining in Jacksonville, and hopefully the city wanted to bring in someone local that had a track record, and it turned out that they did. So we were, just, surprised, but really, really excited to find out that we won the RFP.
There are some people surely out there that perhaps haven't been to a European Street location. So for those who haven't, tell us your footprint as it exists currently and kind of what your presentation is, what your approach is to restauranting, kind of what you offer and the atmosphere.
Well, so I think we're kind of unique in this. We're a gourmet sandwich shop. We've got 85 different gourmet sandwiches, salads. We do a selection of German sausages. We've got a great beer list and wonderful desserts. But we're not the latest restaurant craze is fast casual, order at the counter. We've never been that way. You're still going to come in, you're going to sit down. We've got wonderful servers that are going to guide you through the menu, take good care of you. And then when you get done, you can come look at our candy shop, where we've got, one of the biggest candy selections in the city. to go with our beer section as well.
Yeah, and international candy selection. It's not just necessarily unusual candies that you'd find elsewhere in the United States. It's always had sort of a focus on things that you could really only get traveling abroad.
Absolutely. We started this whole thing in 1980 when my folks bought what was Mr. Dunnerbox in the Regency Square Mall, which had more of a German European theme. We've moved all of that forward, but we still do a lot of German chocolate, Swiss chocolate. We used to bring in Kinder eggs.
Yeah,
but
that was before you could get them other places, right? How will this be different if it is different?
So we're going to have 90% of the menu, almost all of it. We're still playing with some of the things that may not make it into the new location, but we're going to be open a little bit earlier than the other stores are open at 10 a.m. This one will be open at 7 a.m. We'll have a little bit more robust coffee program and a little more robust breakfast offerings. The lunch and dinner menu will stay basically the same. I think we're going to add Italian ice so that you've got a nice frozen treat when you're at the playground. There'll be some more kid-friendly things. We are right underneath an amazing playground, and I've been going down there fairly often to, see what the
Scope
activity level's like, and it's amazing to see the families and everybody down there.
Well, I think it's really neat that European Street Cafe is going to be ushering this new era of the Riverfront Plaza into life. So, Andy Zarka, good luck with everything. Thanks for coming on today.
Thanks for having me.
All right. And thank you for listening. We appreciate everyone who called or emailed. You can always send suggestions or comments to First Coast Connect at wjct.org. First Coast Connect is produced by Stacey Bennett, and our associate producer is Isabella Casapow. Our production interns are Victoria Jones and Elijah Lott. Our show is directed by Brady Corum, and our theme music is performed by Club de Belugas. Join us tomorrow when we break down the priorities and political strategies of the mayor's budget with attorney and analyst Chris Hand. I'm Ann Schindler. You've been listening to First Coast Connect on WJCT News 89.9.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided by Baptist Health and the North Florida TPO.
Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com. The North Florida TPO is dedicated to transportation planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, resilient, and connected region. More information available at northfloridatpo.com. ServPro, independently owned and operated. Whether it's water, mold, or fire damage, they'll help you restore your home or business. ServPro is available 24/7. ServPro, helping to make it like it never even happened.
This is WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville. Up next, national and local news from NPR and the WJCT News team.
What unites dissidents worldwide, and what do their hard-won lessons have to teach everyone? From WAMU and NPR in Washington, this is 1A. Hi, I'm Todd Zwillick. Today on our series, If You Can Keep It, stories and warnings from more than 100 dissidents who fought against authoritarianism worldwide. What they have in common, according to a new book, is the courage to stand up and speak up in the face of significant personal risk.
As long as we are determined and united, there can definitely be a brighter future.
How people around the world are taking up the challenge to preserve democracy or advocate for other changes. But first, election officials respond to the president's latest efforts to undermine the integrity of U.S. elections. That's after the news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Libby Casey. The U.S. Department of Defense says another service member has been killed in the war with Iran, and it has identified 2 other casualties of an Iranian attack in Jordan Friday. NPR's Jane Araf has details.
Central Command says a service member was killed in a controlled detonation of an Iranian drone in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. And the Pentagon announced the names of 2 military personnel killed in an Iranian missile strike Friday on an airbase in Jordan. It said they were First Lieutenant Tyler James Feehan, 25, of Ava Beach, Hawaii. Private Isabella Gonzalez of Carrollton, Texas, died a day later. She was 19. Both were with Air Defense Artillery regiments.